Everybody, welcome again to Great Land Christian Church. Just in case you forgot where you came this morning. As always, and increasingly so actually, I am just really grateful to be here with all of you.
We're grateful to have you.
This Sunday morning. You know, I think it's 2 weeks in a row. It's like a summer record for me to be here and to get the opportunity to preach. And so, you know, they say that distance makes the heart grow fonder, and I think, you know, it's true. At least I'm experiencing that. The more and more I'm gone, I'm like, I miss you guys so much. So again, I love just not to put down Hope Youth Corps, which Natalie and I will be out for the next 2 weeks, or the singles retreat that's coming up. Those are all great things, and we love and are grateful for the opportunity to serve. But I do enjoy, and I look very much to being settled back here in Fairbanks with all of the programs all finished. So very much looking forward to that. Hopefully you are too. Well, hopefully your summer's not been so crazy either. But this morning we're going to continue in the book of Genesis. Woo! And last week we talked a lot about Rebekah and Jacob and how they deceived Isaac to steal Esau's blessing. And then we also talked about how Jacob committed 14 years of his life in order to marry Rachel. And, you know, throughout the lesson last week, the major theme throughout was patience and learning to be patient. Patient when things aren't necessarily going our way, patient when we're not sure what's going to happen, and trusting in God that He's going to see us through the various circumstances that we face. And this past week, I had the opportunity to be hosting Robert Carrillo and Shane Engel. They were up visiting from San Diego. Robert is the CEO of Hope Worldwide, and Shane is their communications director. And so they're responsible for running all of the programs that we run at the Gateway to the Arctic Camp. And so they came up because they wanted to meet and talk about a bunch of new programs and a bunch of new ways that Hope Worldwide can partner with the Gateway to the Arctic Camp, which is really exciting. But one of the things that we did is we wanted to have meetings and we wanted to iron out some details, but we also wanted to show off Alaska, right? And so we went down to go fishing in Seward this past Thursday. And it was during this fishing trip that I was just reminded in a number of ways, but in one way specifically, how important patience can be. And so just so you guys know, we went halibut fishing. The regulations on halibut fishing are that you can only catch 2 halibut in a given day. 4 in a year, but 2 in a given day. So we're only allowed to catch 2. And the rule is that one of those halibut has to be over, I think it's 28 inches, and then the other one has to be under 28 inches. So you have an over and you have an under. And so when you fish and you catch something, if it's over, the captain will ask you, okay, is this the one that you want to keep, right? Because maybe there's another one right out there. So we were fishing, and by the way, I was pretty much sick the entire time, so I hardly did any fishing. It was terrible. But while I was fishing, for the small amount of time that I was, the guy next to me caught a fish. It was his first halibut, and he was very excited about it. And so he reels it on up, and it's an over. It's over 28 inches, but not by much, right? It was probably a 25-pound halibut, something yay big, something like that. I mean, decent, but I mean, okay. So the captain asks him, of course, he's like, okay, is this the one that you'd like to keep as your over? And the rule is, right, if you say yes and they take it out of the water, it counts towards your bag limit. There's no trading later. And so he says, yep, I'm going to keep it. And everybody's like, okay, great. And so we continue to fish. And then fast forward about an hour later, same kid, still standing next to me, hooks another fish. And the rod like bends over in half. And he's excited, he's pulling it in, he's like, oh man. And at this point, the day was kind of slow, so everybody else is like looking over and trying to see what happened. The deckhand, the captain are all looking over, and this monster halibut comes out of the water. And the captain is guessing that it's about a 140-pound fish. Wow. And he knows as he's reeling it up, he's like, you can't keep it. You gotta let it go. So, oh man, and I was just thinking in my mind, I wish as soon as I saw that rod doubled over, I would have like pushed him out of the way, taken it, because then we could have worked out a deal later. I could have given him some of that meat, but it just didn't happen that way. So it just reminded me that patience, man. sometimes it's so important if you want to catch the big fish. Sometimes you got to pass over the smaller stuff and just wait. But it was just a fun story that reminded me of that, and I just felt so bad. There's actually another person that did the same thing, that there's another 100 plus pound halibut that had to get let go because they had already counted towards their limit. So patience is so important, and it does often pay off. So how has your patience been over the last week? Sounds like Tori's been working on it as well, which is good. It's good stuff. We left off last week after Jacob married Leah and then Rachel. And this morning we're going to pick up on their story. So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. It says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive. But Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, 'It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now.' She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, 'Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too.' So she named him Simeon. And again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, 'Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons.' So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, 'This time I will praise the Lord.' So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. In chapter 30 now. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or I'll die.' Jacob became angry with her and said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?' Then she said, 'Here's Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her, so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her.' So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son.' Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won.' So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, 'What good fortune!' So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, 'How happy am I! The women will call me happy.' So she named him Asher." And as we continue in Genesis chapter 30, we see this sort of progress continue. Eventually, Rachel has children as well. And we know that, if you remember from last week, that the circumstances under which Jacob married Leah and Rachel was kind of strange and a little bit weird. But as the family continues to grow, the dysfunction in this family does not get any better. As Jacob begins to have children, we see these 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, start to compete for making babies. They get locked in this bitter rivalry to have children. It became a race to see who could have the most children and when they could have the children. And actually, if you look at the Hebrew of all of these children's names, all of these names reflect this competition, reflect this rivalry that these 2 women had. And unfortunately, the rivalry was causing all kinds of heartache in this family. And it begs a question for us, right? Why would they do this? Why would they get into this baby-making competition? Why would they constantly be trying to one-up each other by having more children? Well, for them, having children became very much part of their identity. They based their value and their self-worth on their ability to have kids. And to be fair to them, this was a very common concept in this day and age. Right? Women were revered for their ability to produce offspring. Right? Women who were more fertile were more highly regarded than those who were not, because it was all about trying to keep the family line going and things like that. And so Rachel and Leah were trying to have so many kids because they wanted to feel valued. They wanted to feel loved. They wanted to base their self-worth in this kind of societal concept of having kids. And more than that, more specifically, they didn't want to just be loved. They didn't want to just be valued. They wanted to be the most loved wife. They wanted to be the most valued wife in Jacob's eyes. And so this became very much part of their core identity, and so they fought for it. Are there parts of your identity that you feel give you your value? Are there elements of your life that you think are a measurement of your self-worth? I think if we're honest, we all have these areas. We all have these areas that we think if we're doing this good, or doing this well, or if we're producing in this way, then we are valuable. That we are doing enough to be worthy of regard or value. Jobs, hell. Grades in school. How you look. How you dress. Money in the bank account. Stuff in your house. Yet are any of these where our value should be coming from? Of course not.
No.
Of course not. Our identity and our value is found in God, period. Mm-hmm. Our identity and value is from Him. We inherently have value because God made us in His own image. Psalms talks about how God made us. We were fearfully and wonderfully made. And so it doesn't matter what our skill set is. It doesn't matter what we're capable of accomplishing, the job that we have, or whatever else it is. We are valuable just because of God. Mm-hmm. We are valuable before Him. Period. And so, does that mean it's wrong then to work hard at our jobs or at school, or do these things and then feel fulfilled? Is it bad to feel satisfied that we put in a hard day of work and we feel good about it?
Definitely.
It's definitely wrong. No, it's not. It's not. Of course, it's not wrong. Those are good things. It's great to have strong work ethic, right? It's great to go into these various pursuits with all of your heart, and it is satisfying when you're doing well in them. So when does it become a problem? When does it become an issue? When it gets all wrapped up in our identity like this, right? It becomes an issue when we start to use those measuring sticks against one another. When we start to look at those things and use them as a way to compare each other against each other. And what that does is it gives rise to all of this envy and judgment. It gives rise to this arrogance and jealousy in our lives. And then, like Rachel and Leah, we end up in this constant competition to one-up each other, to do better, to be the best at whatever it is that we're trying to do. And it, again, this mindset can take over such that it becomes part of our core identity that we must be better than someone else. Mm-hmm. And now I love competition. I like sports. I like beating people in sports. I don't like losing very much. But I think competition is good, but it's not good when all of our identity and self-worth gets tied up in being better than someone else. Mm-hmm. When all of our identity and self-worth gets tied up in the only way I'm valuable is if you're not valuable. The only way I'm valuable is if you're doing poorly and I'm doing better. That's when it's a problem. Yeah. That's when it gives way to all sorts of these issues. Take a look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 4. It says, each one of you should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else, for each one should carry their own load. Mm-hmm. Where do you tend to compare yourself to others? Where do you tend to compare yourself against others? We live in a society that feeds off of comparisons with others. In a world that tells us that the only way that we can look good is if someone else looks bad. That if we are only doing well, if we can prove that we're doing better than somebody else. But we don't have to live there. We don't have to live that existence. We don't have to be constantly trapped by this competition and this rat race of doing something better than someone else. We need to get to that point where we can honestly say, you know what, I am doing my best and that is good enough. I am putting my all out there and I am okay because I know with a clear conscience that I'm doing what I can. Mm-hmm. I feel good about that, regardless of how much better or worse someone is doing the same thing. Are you there? Or are you comparing? Are you stuck in that mindset of comparisons against others? And as we continue the story here, we unfortunately see more of these consequences of this comparison mindset. As Jacob's family is growing, he's also doing very well materially. God continues to bless him. His flocks and herds continue to grow. And in fact, at one point in time, Jacob is trying to go home, and Laban says, you know what, you're helping me out so much, I'll pay you whatever, you just name your wages. And so Jacob decides to stay on, and his wages are all of the streaked and spotted animals. And so he gets paid in all these flocks. And then he separates them out from Laban's animals, which are the solid colored animals. And then Jacob ends up coming up with a really weird, confusing breeding method that ends up producing more spotted animals that are strong and more streaked animals that are strong, and all the weak ones end up going to Laban. And it's interesting because as he does this, as he's living this life, and he's continuing to grow materially, he's continuing to gain more wealth in terms of flocks and herds and camels and all this other stuff, right? Laban starts to take notice, like, wait a minute, Jacob is becoming more wealthy than I am. And so this same sort of competition starts to ensue, and the same sort of negative consequences end up happening as well. So let's take a look here. Genesis chapter 31, verse 1. It says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude towards him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked one will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. So as we look through kind of contextually this conversation here, how was Laban responding to realizing that Jacob's wealth was increasing above and beyond his own? Did he respond well? Did he say, oh, wow, you're doing so well, that's great? No, he did not do that. In fact, he deliberately tries to cheat Jacob. Again, this is this other result of being consumed by the comparisons, where we get so consumed by trying to outdo others that we start to try to make them do worse. James chapter 3, verse 16, I think is quite fitting here. It says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Isn't it true? When we allow ourselves to become envious, when we allow ourselves to become jealous, when we allow ourselves to get in this comparison mindset where we think we must be better than someone else, all kinds of bad things happen. We start to make some very bad decisions and do some bad things. Like Laban, we become mean to the people that we're trying to outdo. And it goes farther than that. Laban actively tried to cheat him out of his wages so that he could not, so that Jacob would not become richer than Laban. But God protected him and instead increased Jacob's wealth. But do you ever find yourself following Laban's example in your way, in this way, in your life? Purposely trying to make someone else fail so that you can be seen as succeeding, so that way you can appear as though you're succeeding. This is something that we've got to constantly watch out for, because again, this is what that comparison mindset does to us. We get so convinced that we have to be better that, okay, well, if I have to be better than someone, that means somebody else has to fail. And now I'm going to make sure that that person's failed, that person's going to screw up, that person's not going to do as well as I am, because I want to look good. Again, it comes back to this very identity, how we judge our own self-worth. So do you follow Laban's example? Do you get caught in this comparison mindset like he did and like Rachel and Leah did? Or are you getting to a point in your life where you're able to say, you know what, I'm doing what I can and I'm okay with that? And it's interesting, you're trying to think of, well, what's the solution? Like, what is the mindset that we need to be in if we're going to do better, right? And I think the next passage is going to help us to see that. So shortly after this, Jacob and his family leave Haran as God instructs, but he's told to go back to his home, back to his relatives. And if you remember last week, you remember that Jacob did not leave his hometown, and he did not leave his relatives on the best of terms. Right? We talked a lot about that last week. Right? We're talking a little bit about identity again. Jacob left an identity at home that was not the best. In many ways, he wasn't so different than Leah and Rachel. He wasn't so different than Laban. He wanted to get what he wanted, right? And so he ended up lying and cheating and stealing and then running away to get it, right? He was also full of this envy. He was also full of this comparison mindset when he left, and it left a path of destruction as he went. And it caused all kinds of problems for the family. And now it's time for him to confront that identity 20 years later. So let's pick up the story. Genesis 32, starting in verse 1. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban, and I have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. I am now sending this message to my lord, that I might find favor in your eyes." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper,' I am unworthy of the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid, and he will come back. I'm afraid he will come back and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." As Jacob heads home 20 years later, we see a very different Jacob than the one that had left 20 years earlier. As he gets in contact with his brother for the first time since he left, notice the language that he uses. He calls him my Lord. He says, "I'm your servant," to Esau. Which, if you remember, right, Jacob had the birthright. Jacob had the blessing from Isaac. From every technical way and from technical perspective, Jacob was the superior one. Esau was the servant. Jacob was the Lord. But he doesn't choose to lord it over Esau at this particular point in time. Instead, he humbles himself before Esau. He says, "I'm your servant." He says, "You are my Lord." And then, when he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men and gets reasonably afraid of what Esau might do, what does Jacob do? How does he respond to that realization? He prays. He goes to God, and he recognizes that God has shown him all kinds of kindness that he doesn't deserve. He recognizes that God has promised him some things, and he demonstrates his faith, but he prays for protection. And so what does he end up doing, in other words? He humbles himself before God. And so what is the solution to the envy and the jealousy and all of the strife that comes along with it when it comes to looking at these stories of Rachel and Leah and with Laban and Jacob? What's the solution? Humility. Humility before others and humility before God. This is the answer to all of the issues that come out from comparing ourselves to others. The answer to all that envy and strife that results from those comparisons. Humble yourself before God and before others. Stop trying to one-up one another. Stop trying to gain at somebody else's expense. Instead, just be humble. What a powerful concept. To be willing to subject our wants, our desires to others and to God. And to say, you know what? I want your stuff to be taken care of the way it's supposed to be. Especially to God. I want your will to be done. Right? And then even to those that we have disagreements with, being willing to let go and say, you know what? I'm going to be humble here, and we'll just let you do those things, right? Assuming that they're righteous, etc. It's more easily said than done, though, isn't it? To be humble, especially in those circumstances. Yeah. But it's one of the major keys here. Humility. How are you practicing humility in your life? How are you submitting yourself and your wants to God and to those around you? This concept, again, is so important. Because when we practice humility, it does change us. It does change our relationships. It does solve so many relational issues that we have. It helps us to get away from focusing just on ourselves and helps us to get outward focused on God and on one another and on their needs instead of just what we want. It helps us to realize God's presence in our lives and how he's worked through us and for us despite the fact that we don't deserve it at all. See, when we're not humble, we don't get any of that. When we're not humble, we think we're right. We think that we deserve what it is. We think that we deserve the right to put people down because they're clearly worse than us. Right? When we're not humble, we don't realize God's working through us because we think that we deserve all the good things that are coming to us. Because we've done so well. Because we're so great. But when we're humble, wow, it makes those relationships a lot easier. Because nobody likes prideful people, do they? Nobody likes prideful people that want to put you down to make themselves look better. Nobody likes that. But sometimes we are that. We practice that instead of humility. So again, how are you practicing humility? Jacob, after 20 years, was starting to get it. He was being humble. So what happens to Jacob next? How do things with Esau work out? Well, next week.
Ha-ha.
Well, Keith is going to decide how far he wants to go. So he might not tell you either. I don't know.
I'm not going to tell you.
He's not going to say what's going to happen. You got to stick around. But I really want to leave you guys with this concept of humility because it is so important, because it does have so much power. And we have the perfect example of humility's power, don't we? As we look towards the cross of Christ. The ultimate example of humility and the power that it has. Because we have Jesus, who is God, who has more right than anybody in the entire universe to lord his power over us. To say, you need to do this. To say, I am better than you, you are worse. More right than any of us ever could hope to have. To say that, and to do that, and to lord that power over us. But he didn't. Instead, he took the path of a servant. He said, I am here to serve. That was his whole attitude. He humbled himself. And yes, he humbled himself and became obedient to death. Even death on a cross. A death, by the way, that was motivated by envy. That same jealousy that consumed Rachel and Leah and Jacob and Laban. Because if you remember, that's why the Pharisees killed Jesus. That they were losing their influence over the religious world. They didn't like it. And so they killed Jesus to try to get it back. They needed to make him look bad so they could look good. But Jesus was obedient to death for us. He combated that envy and comparison mindset with humility. And so as usual, we're going to close with communion this morning. And it's the time to honor Jesus' humility. Time to remember his humility that brought him to the cross. Though he is God, he willingly chose to die as a lowly criminal. And so this morning, I want you to think about how you need to grow in this area of humility, of humbleness. And my encouragement to you is to find opportunities this week to practice humility, to practice being humble. Practice being humble, and find those opportunities to demonstrate that humility with your friends, with your spouse, if you're married, with your children, if you've got kids, with your coworkers, where you're working. Allow God to show you that living this way will truly change you as it did Jacob. Let's go ahead and pray for the community. Lord God, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much that it continues to teach us and guide us and help us to see your character and who you are and what you want us to do and how you want us to live. Lord, thank you for even the bad examples that we see in the Bible of people who were not living with humility, the people that were filled with envy and this comparison mindset. God, thank you for the stories that we see and how it did not work out well for them, so that we know and that we look in our lives and say, well, we don't want to be like that. God, help us to really work on our hearts, to work on our humility, to be able to subject ourselves before you, first and foremost, but also to one another and their needs, instead of constantly being focused on how we need to be better. Help us just to focus on needing to be with you and realizing that you are Lord. God, I pray that you work with us and provide us with opportunities to be humble and help us to see those opportunities so that way we can live for you, that way we can glorify you as you deserve. Lord, we love you so much. We praise you. Pray that you bless this time. It's in your Son's name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.
Amen.